I want to talk a little bit about what holistic management is, or what holistic decision making is in practical terms, like in a real life situation, to explain the difference between our current reductionist decision making process, where we just make a decision, we'll copy and paste decision with no real thought to the long term social, economic, and ecological elements that every decision we make entails, because everything we use or consume or manufacture has been provided by nature, which means every decision we make has social, economic, and ecological considerations to balance. So I'm going to use an example of a farming practice that's been rolled out here in Zimbabwe by government. Now, there's nothing wrong with the practice at all, and it will work in certain situations. But the problem with our reductionist decision making, where we're not checking all three elements of a decision for ourselves, is we just copy and paste, but we're all dealing with entirely unique social, economic, and environmental circumstances. So we teach the holistic decision making framework, which ensures that decision makers are tying their economic and social stability to environmental health. So environmental health is made paramount, while at the same time understanding that you can't just make a decision for the environment without simultaneously balancing the social and economic aspects of that decision, because nobody is going to make a decision for the environment if it's going to end up crippling them socially and financially in the long run. So we have to always balance those inseparable elements of our decisions. Now, the holistic management framework is a guiding filtering process which essentially makes it impossible for anyone to make a wrong decision for themselves, because the right decision will float to the top through the process. And it also will immediately show a wrong decision. And when we're trying to address a problem in this framework, we also first ask, if I take this action, am I addressing the root cause of the problem I'm trying to solve? In other words, am I addressing a symptom, or have I zoomed out to root cause? So this farming practice has been rolled out by government in Zimbabwe, and like I said, it's a brilliant practice in theory, but when you're putting it into a complex social, economic, and environmental situation that's different even from between neighbors, there's more to consider than just copy and pasting a practice. So this practice, they advise people to plant 3 different seeds in straight lines, and then the government provides chemical fertilizer for it, and then they mulch it with grass. That's basically the practice. So I went into the rural areas to see how this was being carried out and what was happening. So the first plot I went to, they'd done their straight lines and had cut down any trees that were in the way of the straight lines, which immediately is causing environmental damage, which is going to affect everybody socially and economically, because everything we use or consume comes from nature. So our economic and social stability depends on increasing biodiversity on the land. So they'd cut the trees down because they'd just copy and pasted the practice. Straight lines, plant the seeds. They'd mulched with chemical fertilizers, which again isn't ideal if your ecological health is paramount. So you should be looking for a better action, which I'll discuss just now. And they'd mulched their field beautifully with thatching grass, which had immediately caused a social upheaval, because there were some neighbors that wanted it for thatching and there were others that needed it for livestock. So you can see the social, economic, and ecological aspects very quickly in that situation. Then I went to another lady's village plot, and she'd beautifully done the same thing. She hadn't actually cut any trees down because she already had her plot there, and she'd mulched her whole field with the thatching grass, which had caused social conflict with neighbors as well because of thatching and livestock food. But she'd cut huge branches off, and she'd cut down several trees and put them across the top of the grass to stop the wind blowing the grass away. And I was like, oh. So there's again an unintended consequence of copy and pasting without taking into account the unique complexity that's going to be involved, and you can't predict what the wind's going to do or what that person's going to do, etc. So then I went to one of my guys that I've trained in the holistic decision making process, and he'd taken the practice and he liked it, and he thought it was a good idea. So all he did was use this framework to adapt the practice to suit his unique social, financial, and environmental circumstances. So he'd taken indigenous seed because that culturally was what he wanted. So he'd changed the seed into what he wanted. He'd planted it and gone around his trees because he knows that ecological health is paramount. And when he'd done the social check on the fertilizer, instead of using the chemical fertilizer, he used his livestock BOMID overnight on his field to fertilize it and impact the field. And then when he did the thatching grass, the social check of that, he realized that there's going to be a social element to this. And what he did is he just broke off leafy branches, small branches of trees, and he mulched his field with that. So there was no social conflict, there was no environmental damage. And do you see, it's exactly the same practice, but he adjusted it for his unique social, economic, and ecological complexity. And that's, in a nutshell, what the holistic management framework does, is it empowers the decision maker to make the right decision for them, no matter what their unique complexity. And I teach this to very young children, and I had a class of 8-year-olds, and their teacher wasn't picking it up as quickly as them, because it is difficult to teach adults new ways of making decisions, even though it's simple, because adults actually miss the simplicity of this. So I walked in, and my kids have a holistic context that guides all their decisions in their class, that ties their social and economic stability to the environment. And they have a little few filtering questions, like if we take this action, they do a social, an economic, and an environmental check, and a root cause check. And I walked in and they said, "Sarah, our teacher made a reductionist decision that affected us socially and it affected the environment, and she didn't even think about it." And what it was is the teacher had removed a wasp's nest out of the classroom that was just in the corner, and it wasn't affecting anybody, and so it harmed the environment, and the kids were upset because they now know that biological health is paramount and looking after nature is paramount. And so that just is a very simple example of it in just a classroom situation. And on the social aspect of these checks, I found that it really, really gives kids responsibility for how they must behave towards their classmates, friends, family, etc. because of the social check. So again, when there was bullying or people being jealous of something, they would say, "Hey, that behavior is not right in our context, and we need to." So we're stopping bullying and just making kids aware of connecting those three things all the time, and the social, the financial, and the environmental. So I hope that helps to give you some idea of just this. It's a very simple guiding filtering framework with massive improvements on stopping short-term objectives being met without considering long-term consequences of all three elements simultaneously.